Hello, everyone. Obviously, I'm not Dr. Stedia. My name is Daniel Deira. I'm a PhD student in Dr. Stedia's lab, and today I will be guest lecturing on minerals. So what are minerals? Minerals are solid crystalline substances that don't have carbon molecules and are not broken down by digestion. And in addition to this, they're also resistant to damage induced by heat, cold, light, exposure to chemicals, or mechanical force. So this is in contrast to other nutrients which are susceptible to damage by these stimuli. Despite the fact that minerals compose only about 4% of our total body weight, they also are important for a number of different physiological processes, which I will get into. So minerals carry an electrical charge, and this is important for a couple of things. First, the electrical charge in minerals allows them to attract water. And what this does is it allows for the regulation of osmotic properties of bodily fluids and the electrolytic balance of the body. So in other words, this is important for hydration and function of several things, as well as the osmotic balance of fluids. The electrical charge of minerals is also important because it allows for the transmission of nerve impulses and for muscle contraction to occur. So if you remember back to physiology, the depolarization and hyperpolarization of a nerve or a neuron to reach an action potential is dependent on things like sodium, potassium, and chloride, which are all very important ions in that context. And finally, minerals also confer hardness to bones and teeth, right? And they are components of enzymes that allow the enzymes to function. So minerals can be broken down into two main categories, either macro or micro minerals. And as the names imply, they are either required in larger or lower quantities. So the macro minerals, you need more than 100 milligrams per day, or at least 100 milligrams per day of these minerals. And micro minerals, you're usually required to take in less than 100 milligrams per day. So your macro minerals represent more than 0.01% of your total body mass, and these are minerals like sodium, potassium, phosphorus, chloride, calcium, magnesium, as well as sulfur. Your micros, on the other hand, are selenium, fluoride, iodine, chromium, manganese, iron, zinc, and copper. So these minerals can be further broken down into some functional categories that really depicts what it is that they do at the inside of the body. So there are minerals that are power generators. They're involved in metabolism and the conversion of food into energy. So iodine, for example, is one that we're going to be getting into, extremely important in carbohydrate and fat metabolism. But you also have chromium, manganese, sulfur, and selenium. Then you have minerals that are blood fortifiers, right? They're important for erythropoiesis, the formation of red blood cells, as well as the function of the blood, which in major part is to carry oxygen and nutrients to tissues that require oxygen and nutrients. So you have iron, zinc, and copper. We've already discussed electrolytic balance, right? So there are minerals that are important for hydration and muscle function and the maintenance of the electrolytic balance. We have phosphorus, potassium, sodium, and chloride. And finally, bone builders. One of the most notorious ones, I guess you could say, is calcium, but you also have phosphorus, magnesium, and fluoride, which are very important in the maintenance of bone structure and bone function. So these are a lot of minerals, and just based off the fact that it would take me more than one lecture to go over all of these minerals, I'll be going through three main ones. The first is calcium. So the approximate content of calcium in the body is about 1.4 kilos. And the majority of it is found in your bones and teeth. So about 99% of it is in your bones and teeth. And the remaining 1% is inside of cells, so intra, and around cells, extracellular fluids. The primary functions, or what calcium does in the body, extends just beyond composing bones and teeth, or making up bones and teeth. Calcium is also important for acting as a buffer. So it maintains pH, and it really maintains the acid-base balance It's very important in muscle contraction. So if you remember back to physiology, when your muscle cell is stimulated, there's an intracellular release of calcium, which then facilitates cross-bridge formation and the occurrence of a contraction inside of the muscle cell. So calcium is very important for muscle contraction. It's also an ion that is implicated in the transmission of nerve impulses. It is a factor in the blood clotting cascade, and it's also a cofactor for the activation of a number of enzymes, such as calcium-dependent kinases, adenylyl cyclase, protein kinases, calcium, magnesium ATPase, and so on and so forth. So calcium is important for a number of physiological functions, but how does it become the food that we eat to the mineral that's circulating in our system? So you ingest calcium and it becomes digested. You only really absorb about 25 to 30% of the calcium that you ingest. And this absorption rate is a little bit higher for specific calcium supplements. You could raise it to about 27 to 39% absorption. One thing that seems to be important for calcium absorption is how much you actually consume at any given time. So if you consume less than 500 milligrams, apparently the absorption is better. And another thing that promotes absorption is the accompanying foods that you eat calcium with. So you actually will absorb more calcium. Let's say you take it in this isolated form, you will absorb more calcium if it's eaten with certain foods versus if it's eaten in isolation and you're fasted, let's say, for example. So when you take in supplements or you consume food that contains calcium, it usually is in the form of an insoluble salt. And as a result, calcium has to be liberated to a free ionized soluble form in order for it to be absorbed. Though it is important to note that just because it is liberated and in its free ionized form, it doesn't guarantee absorption, because calcium can bind to other dietary constituents, other things in your diet that will inhibit its absorption and limit its bioavailability, some of which I'll go over in a couple of slides. So the absorption happens in the duodenum and proximal jejunum, and it's absorbed mainly by two mechanisms. So one of which is diffusion, and one is by saturable carrier-mediated active transport. And there are four main transporters for calcium. There is the TRPV6, so the transient receptor potential of amyloid, and then you have another three which are unique in their own way. There's calcium transporter 1, calbindin D9K, and calcium ATPase pump. So these three transporters are actually vitamin D dependent. So as you can imagine, vitamin D is a dietary constituent or another nutrient that really enhances calcium absorption. And then the other method of, or the other mechanism whereby calcium is absorbed is by diffusion. So it's a concentration dependent mechanism. So remember, calcium absorption, two main pathways, so via active transport and via diffusion. And then under the transporter umbrella, you have four main transporters, three of which are vitamin D dependent. So as I mentioned before, there are certain things that limit the absorption of a free ionized calcium. And these are things like fiber, phytic acid, oxalic acid, and you have unabsorbed fatty acids as well. And factors that enhance calcium absorption are vitamin D, like we discussed, sugars, sugar alcohols, and protein. So once your calcium is absorbed from your intestine, it is taken up into your plasma. And like several other physiological factors, your body likes to maintain calcium within a physiological range. And in this case, it's 8.5 to 10.5 milligrams per deciliter. And you have receptors in your thyroid gland, as well as in your parathyroid gland, that will regulate this. And I'm just going to skip over a couple of slides, which is just the written version of what I'm going to describe here, but I'm going to use this diagram to go over this regulation of plasma concentration levels for calcium. So let's say you have low circulating calcium. Let's say you're under that 8.5 milligrams per deciliter. Your parathyroid glands, which are typically on the posterior portion of your thyroid gland, will detect this lower circulating calcium level. As a result, it will increase its release of a hormone known as parathyroid hormone. Right? Parathyroid gland releases parathyroid hormone. And parathyroid hormone will then go and act or perform several functions or several actions to try to increase your plasma calcium levels. So one thing it does is it increases osteoclast activity in the bone. And what this does is it increases the resorption or the release of calcium into your plasma. On the other hand, you have parathyroid hormone increasing the conversion of vitamin D3 into 25-hydroxycholecalciferol in the liver. And then 25-hydroxycholecalciferol will then be processed in the kidney, hydroxylated into 1,25-hydroxycholecalciferol, which is a mouthful. But the simpler term, and the term I'll use from now on, is calcitriol. And what calcitriol does is its functions are twofold, primarily. The first of which is to increase calcium absorption at the level of the intestine. You increase your absorption in the digestive tract. Secondly, calcitriol will act on your kidney, and it will promote the reabsorption of calcium so that it's not excreted, so that you have a greater quantity of it being reabsorbed to circulate. So, in other words, parathyroid hormone will act at the level of the bone to increase calcium resorption, and once again, it will increase calcitriol synthesis, and calcitriol will in turn increase calcium absorption at the level of the intestine and calcium reabsorption at the level of the kidney. So on the other side of the spectrum, on the other hand, when you have too much circulating calcium, your thyroid gland or the parafollicular cells of your thyroid gland will detect this, and there will be an increased secretion from your thyroid gland of something called calcitonin. And calcitonin acts one of two ways mainly. The first is by decreasing or suppressing the release of parathyroid hormone from the parathyroid gland, and the second is by decreasing osteoclast activity at the level of the bone and decreasing calcium resorption. So you're really just passing away more calcium in your bone, and you're preventing it from being released from bone and into the bloodstream. So two opposing mechanisms, but both with the common purpose of maintaining physiological calcium concentration. So how much calcium should we be taking in to kind of maintain the quantity that is required for function? Well, in adults, approximately 19 to 50 years of age, you need about 1,000 milligrams per day, about a gram per day of calcium. In men and women over 50 years of age, you require a little bit more. And the reason for that is intuitive. As you age, bone mineral density and frailty and the brittleness of the bone becomes a major concern. And as a result, you do need to take in a bit more calcium. Your upper limit is about 2,500 milligrams per day. It's not recommended to go over that typically. Where can you get calcium from? How can I meet these requirements? Well, one particular source, and perhaps the best absorbed form of calcium, is in milk and milk products. Now, one thing that really helps this is the coexistence of vitamin D, a fat-soluble vitamin, in these milk and milk products. But they're also very rich in calcium. You have sardines without edible bones, also have calcium, clams, oysters, and then you have vegetables, which also have calcium. Broccoli and bok choy actually have a high bioavailability of calcium. You have other things like legumes, dried fruits, calcium-fortified juices, all of which have this. So what happens if we're not meeting these, what happens if we're not taking in enough calcium? We're at a deficiency, let's say. So you could develop a number of conditions like rickets and osteomalacia, which just refer to a more softness of the bone. They're not as solid. They're not, the structure is a bit compromised. In fact, in osteomalacia, which almost literally translates to soft bone, the individuals present with, instead of having a solid femurs, they present with bowing femurs, right? Which is concerning in of itself. One other condition that we're very much aware of is osteoporosis. So bone mineral density loss, you have with aging more risk of fracture, injury, and so on and so forth. Tetany, if you're deficient or you're calcium deficient, tetany is an issue. So what that is uncontrolled or involuntary muscle contraction that could happen, and dysregulation. We talked about how muscle is really, you do need calcium for muscle function. So this is a perfect example of that. You have heart failure and convulsions also, which are potential risks when you have you're deficient of calcium. Toxicity, mineral imbalances, shock, kidney failure, and fatigue and mental confusion are all symptoms of toxicity. So moving on, we have iodine. So the majority of your iodine is in the thyroid gland. We're talking about 75 to 80% of the iodide in your body is in your thyroid gland. And on a daily basis, your thyroid gland will take up about 120 micrograms of iodide and use it to produce thyroid hormone. And what this does, and what thyroid hormone does, it's important for regulating energy metabolism, protein synthesis, and even in fetal development, it's important for brain and skeletal development in the fetus, which I'll be coming back to in a couple of slides as well. So when we consume a particular food that does have iodine, it could be bound to amino acids, and this is known as organified iodine, or it could be found as free iodate or iodide. And iodide just happens to be the most efficiently absorbed, right? When you digest an organified iodine, what happens is it's freed from the amino acid and it becomes an iodide in the GI tract. However, some organified iodide can escape digestion and it can actually be absorbed as an organified iodine. But again, the most efficiently absorbed is your iodide. So we know that iodide is important for thyroid hormone production. You have T3 and T4, which are the two main thyroid hormones. So T3 would be triiodothyronine and T4 is thyroxine. And they're actually absorbed mostly unchanged. So if you were to take this in an oral medication, you would absorb about 70% of the T4, which makes it a viable option for thyroid hormone supplementation if you would need it. So as I mentioned before, iodine, the function that it plays is it's important for the synthesis of thyroid hormone, and these thyroid hormones are important for temperature regulation, thermogenesis, reproduction, carbon fat metabolism, protein synthesis, and growth. T3 and T4 are not available in the body in equal amounts. In fact, T4, it makes up about 90% of the available thyroid hormone in the body, but, and this is a whopping factor, T3 is 5 times more potent than T4, which is very interesting. But nevertheless, both are present and both play important physiological functions, of which I've already mentioned. So the recommended intake for iodine to support these functions is approximately 150 micrograms per day. So this is slightly over the amount that the thyroid gland will take in to then use for thyroid hormone synthesis. And your upper limit is about 1,100 micrograms per day, or that converts to 1.1 milligrams per day. So your dietary sources, you have your salt. Iodized salt has iodine, salt water, skim milk, and cheddar cheese. Liver is a source of iodine as well. Eggs and seafood are all sources. So what happens if you're deficient? So there are a number of things that can happen if you're deficient. The first is goiter. And I actually took this course a few years ago it was taught by Dr. Seti at the time, and he gave a really good analogy for goiter. So goiter happens when you're deficient in iodine, as we know, and you really want to maintain thyroid hormone levels that you've been maintaining up until then before your deficiency. And so what your thyroid gland does is it enlarges in an attempt to maintain the thyroid hormone levels. But let's use this analogy. Let's say you're a baker and you work at a bakery and you want to produce more bread. And so you upgrade from a residential level oven to an industrial grade oven that almost takes up your entire bakery. In your mind, you say, I have a greater capacity to produce thyroid hormone, so I'm going to make, or I have a greater capacity to produce bread, so I'm going to produce more bread. Now, if you're not increasing the amount of dough that you're making, or if you're actually decreasing the amount of dough that you're making, no matter how big your oven is, you're not going to make more bread. Much in the same way, if I have a bigger thyroid gland, but I don't have that much iodine, the size of my thyroid gland won't really make much of a difference. I won't be able to produce more thyroid hormone just because of the size of my tissue or my organ. It really relies on the substrate that is really the limiting factor in thyroid hormone production. So hypothyroidism, well, it could come about, so you're not producing enough thyroid hormone. And then you have, back to the fetal development, something called cretinism, where you have stunted growth and deficits in mental development in infants of mothers who are iodine deficient. So evidently an important factor in fetal development. Symptoms of toxicity, you have burning of the mouth, throat, and stomach, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, fever, and you could even cause inflammation in your thyroid gland if you're consuming too much of it or ingesting too much of it. It's called thyroiditis. And the last mineral I'm going to be going over is going to be iron. So it's in the human body and in food in either the ferrous state, so Fe2+, and in the ferric state, so Fe3+. Most of your iron in the human body, so about 66%, found in red blood cells as a part of hemoglobin. So we know hemoglobin is the pigment that binds and transports oxygen to tissues, right? In the foods that we eat, you have heme and non-heme iron. So heme iron is complex in heme structures like myoglobin and cytochrome in animal food. And non-heme iron is found in plant and plant-derived foods. Now what's different between these two is that heme iron is better absorbed than non-heme iron. We're talking 25 to 35% for heme iron in terms of absorption, and you're talking 2 to 20% of non-heme iron in terms of absorption. So this is your heme iron that we were just discussing. You have your iron right in the middle. You have it surrounded by a perforin ring. But when it comes in through your food, it's available, let's say, as a hemoglobin or a myoglobin. And your heme iron has to be released from that globin portion. And that happens via digestion with gastric acidity and so on. And so what ends up happening is your heme iron, now that it's free from the globin, it could be absorbed through the brush border of the enterocyte by, and you guessed it, heme carrier protein 1. So that's an easy one to remember. So what will enhance iron absorption? Vitamin C, gastric acidity, lactic and tartaric acid. And it's really the acidity that's promoting that separation, the heme from the globin, the digestion of your iron-containing foods. And these iron-containing foods, as we know, are meat, fish, and poultry. And the reason that they enhance iron absorption, or we've said that they enhance iron absorption, is because it's predominantly heme iron versus non-heme iron, one that's better absorbed than the other. What limits iron absorption? So you have phytates, which is present in whole grains, oxalates, which are present in spinach, berries, chocolates, and teas, and you have tannins, which is present mostly in tea. So phytates, oxalates, and tannins. These two things will bind the iron and form what's called a chelator, which does not allow it, or it reduces its absorption in the intestine. Interestingly, calcium, either from food or supplements, also reduces iron absorption. So iron transport, once it is absorbed, is transported by a protein called transferrin. Excuse me, and this protein has two binding sites, and it doesn't just bind iron, it binds copper, it binds zinc, but it has the greatest affinity, or it most effectively binds ferric iron. And this is followed by copper, then it most effectively binds manganese, and it has a high affinity for cadmium, zinc, and nickel in that declining order. But it most effectively, or it has the highest affinity for ferric iron. So once your iron reaches the tissue, remember we have ferrous, which is Fe2+, and you have ferric, which is Fe3+. The ferrous iron has to be oxidized to ferric iron. And this actually requires a protein. This process, oxidation, requires a protein called copper transport protein. And you see copper in the name of this protein, and that's exactly because of what you think. Copper is important for this oxidation step to take place. So copper deficiency, in fact, can cause anemia by reducing circulating ferric iron levels and its delivery to sites of erythropoiesis in the bone. You're limiting red blood cell formation in bone. So copper definitely is very important for the processing of ferrous iron to ferric iron. In tissues, there are tissues that are very much have the propensity to store iron. And these are tissues like liver, bone marrow, intestine, and spleen. And the spleen is also there for red blood cell catabolism, but these are primarily sites of iron absorption, storage, and red blood cell catabolism. So ferritin is very, very good it's the primary site for iron storage. Hemosiderin is another iron storage protein, and it comes from the breakdown of ferritin. So for iron storage, two main proteins, ferritin and hemosiderin. Hemosiderin. What does iron do? Well, why do we need it? Well, we've already talked about why it's important for oxygen transport and use, but it's an important cofactor in a number of enzymes, cytochrome, catalase, myeloperoxidase, thioperoxidase, lysine, and proline. Essentially, iron plays an important role in a number of enzymes. In fact, if you think about your mitochondria and you think about your electron transport chain, iron is an important component in the electron transport chain for the transport of electrons. So iron, even in the mitochondria for the production of ATP, is an important mineral. It's important for energy production, also for amino acid metabolism, the synthesis of carnitine, collagen, and thyroid hormone. It's also very important for those things. And interestingly, it's a pro-oxidant through what's called the Sentinel reaction. So in your mitochondria, with respiration, you produce something called hydrogen peroxide, or H2O2. And iron will actually react with this to form a hydroxyl radical, or free radical, which is typically, well, it's deemed to be a less positive thing. You tend to not want free radicals because it can cause damage to lipids and proteins in your cells. So this is probably a less positive connotation in which we see iron. So how much iron should we be taking in per day? 8 milligrams per day for men, 18 for women 19 to 50 years of age, and 8 milligrams per day for women over 50 years of age. And the discrepancy here between women 19 to 50 and women after 50 years of age is that you have premenopausal and postmenopausal women. So women who are premenopausal have their menstrual cycle, they lose blood with their period, and so there is a greater demand for red blood cell formation and to replace what you've lost, and so iron is required in greater quantities. The upper limit should be about 45 milligrams per day. So we know that meat and liver are good for meeting these daily recommended intake numbers. Molasses, clams, oysters are also good. And then you have some vegetable options as well for iron intake. So green leafy vegetables, nuts, legumes, dried fruits, and enriched whole grains as well for iron. But as you can imagine, there's meats which have the heme iron, and then you have your vegetables which have the non-heme iron. but these are all sources of iron. So deficiency in particularly could be more common in these populations or these demographics. So young children and adolescents undergoing rapid growth, females because of menstrual iron loss of their period, and pregnant women because of their expanding blood volume. Usually larger quantities of iron might be required. If these individuals are deficient in iron, or if anyone is deficient in iron, what you have is anemia and fatigue, tired, you have an impaired work performance, and you're also more susceptible to infection. So evidently there is an important role in immune function as well for iron. So that is my lecture on minerals. I hope you all enjoyed. I hope you took something from this that you'll be able to remember for the years to come. I wish you all the best of luck in the weeks to come in the course, and take care.